Hello and welcome to Solely Singleton, Season 13, Episode 8. I'm your host, Brad. This is my co-host, Eric.
How's it going?
We have an exciting little episode for you guys today. We're going to be talking for hopefully only like 15-20 minutes, but we're doing a tutorial on how to Minesweeper Draft. This is the custom draft format we've mentioned in the past several times. I mentioned it on the Star City Games panel. We've mentioned it in our different ways to draft episode from 100 years ago. It's been brought up since then, but it was brought up by some of our patrons that we mentioned it recently and didn't explain what it was again. And basically it would really benefit from just having a quick tutorial episode in our more modern quality that we could point people toward.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Eric, Minesweeper Draft. Walk us through the basics.
So this is our take on the quilt draft, which has been popular for a while. It's just we're too dumb to make quilt drafting work correctly. So we made this, which is easier.
I think this is far enough removed at this point with all the things we've altered over time that the comparison is very loose at this point. Also, quilt drafting is an ancient enough drafting format that I don't think many people even know what it is anymore.
That's probably true.
So give us the rundown of the very basics of how it functions.
So you basically take a bunch of cards, lay them out in a grid face down, then you turn the outer edge of that grid face up and the two centermost cards face up.
Or 4 or 1, depends on how the grid is, like number by number.
Right. Yeah. Then you basically draft like normal. And when you take a card, you flip all of the cardinal directions that touch that card. So not the diagonals, just the north, south, east, west. So those 4 cards get flipped as well. And then you can take those. You can only take a face up card. Then you basically draft through that a certain amount of cards for that grid. Then you take all of those cards, put them to the side, put a new grid down, flip the outer edge, flip the middle 2 or whatever. Again, draft the face up. Anytime you draft a card, you flip the cardinal directions, so you could draft those as well now. And you do that grid some number of times. So an example to kind of make this a little bit easier, with 4 players, you make a grid of 9 by 10 cards face down. You turn up all the outer edges, you turn up the 2 centermost cards. Then a person takes a card that's face up, you flip the other ones in cardinal directions. Cool. You counterclockwise draft like normal. Then when you've taken 9 cards from that grid, take all those cards and push them to the side, set up a new grid, 9 by 10, flip the outer edge, flip the centers, draft. And you do that for a total of 4 times for all 4 players starting, basically. End up with a card pool of 36 cards. That's an easy example, and it's what we commonly do with 4 players. So that's kind of where we like it.
Yeah, so we invented the format specifically because we have a lot of 4-player drafts when we play. And when you've got a 4-player draft, it can be awkward to do a standard draft at 3 by 15.
Yeah.
4 by 11 is nice, or 5 by 9 is nice.
Yeah, I like 5 by 9.
But when doing a normal draft like that, you're also limited in the card pool compared to the cube size, so you start fractionally having less of the cube available to you.
Which adds more randomness, and it can become more problematic for certain combo things like show and tell or sneak attack, those kinds of decks. Like you have to have things work and come together. Well, with a lower card pool, it just might not be in that draft.
And the worst offenders are usually your weakest combos in the cube, like Wildfire suffers terribly.
Yes.
Things that don't have the redundancy available to them that other decks do. That's the word, not recurring.
Yeah, so with this, you get to see a lot more cards, and that means that your pool of cards is a lot higher.
And from a power standpoint, we have found that this is a much higher power level than a standard draft would be at the same size of player count.
Right.
So to make up for this, you only draft, in the 4-player variant that we play, you only draft 36 cards, not 45. This will still lead to stronger decks than 45 cards via standard drafting. and you have a lot more open information about what everyone is drafting, so it's very unlikely you'll be making late pivots into a different deck unless you're really being forced into it and it's a good idea.
It's one of those that late pivots can happen, but it's usually not as drastic of like, I was doing mono red aggro and now I'm going to do blue white control. It's more of like, first draft, I had a bunch of red cards that I'm looking at red aggro. Kind of didn't really work out, and I'm pivoting into a more Mardu aristocracy build.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's one of those that because there's open information, if you take wildfire, all the other players know you took wildfire. So they're not going to take burning.
The open information also is very nice for when you have new players drafting your cube, someone who is either new to drafting cube or just your specific environment, or it's a major update to your environment and you want to be able to talk people through things that you've got in there now that you didn't before or maybe missing.
Right.
Talk about picks openly like that.
It's actually really fun because of that. Like the draft experience is like a group experience of like you kind of talk about all the picks of everybody and like kind of like, oh, let's see what what can you pick from this based on your picks, because we all have open knowledge and you just kind of like have fun drafting like with everybody.
Yeah, it's almost like playing a multiplayer game before playing the one-on-one cube rounds afterwards.
Right.
Like the draft format is a long draft format. It takes an hour plus, especially with table talk, which is encouraged because it's kind of the point of the open draft format. Then once you're done doing the actual drafting portion, you build your decks and play usually only 2 rounds, because at 4 people you play 2 rounds. This is something that I saw on the Cube subreddit that I guess just some people aren't aware of why we play X rounds of Magic. The point of playing a certain number of rounds of Magic is so that you only have one undefeated person. So at 2 players, only 1 round is required. At 4 players, 2 rounds is required. At 8 players, 3 rounds is required. This is, obviously it scales up with time. That's why GPs have so many rounds to them.
Right.
But at a 4-player game, you only need to do 2 rounds of Magic to get your undefeated deck. You could run a 3rd round if you're really having fun, but we like the longer draft plus 2 rounds when you're playing with 4 people rather than have a less great draft and do the round robin face everybody thing.
It ends up being about the same amount of time of the longer draft with only 2 rounds versus the normal draft with 3 rounds. So you don't have to like stake extra time out. During the open information, it's also quite nice for the cube designer to get feedback from the drafters of like, well, why aren't you picking that? I put that in the cube for your deck kind of thing. And like you can just talk about it without any like, oh, I don't want to say anything because I don't want people to know what I'm drafting, you know?
Yeah, but it's a great way to get perception of the cards that are in your cube from your drafters. So you can figure out why certain things aren't being drafted highly. Maybe it is your drafters and you disagree on how strong a certain card is, or you've misevaluated how useful a card may be for certain archetypes that you thought you were putting it in for, and the drafters point out like, no, it doesn't work the way that I think this deck should be played. A key one of this would be the different members of my playgroup, how we approach reanimators, a famous schism among my playgroup. Rather,
Yeah.
I prefer control decks that happen to have reanimation, where other players would rather play the very combo heavy win or lose on turn 3 variant of the deck.
Yeah, and you can also sort of get a feel for the cards that your drafters just enjoy, because like they can just be like, yeah, I mean, I get that this other card's probably stronger in my deck, but I want to do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because, when you're just kind of talking about picks, that's kind of something that comes up where it's like, yeah, I get that that's probably the right pick, but I'm going to take this other one because I find it more fun.
Yeah, and while I talk about the boon of it for teaching new drafters, you can only teach new drafters as well as the rest of you play.
That's true.
So they're going to pick up on the same habits the rest of the playgroup has when they do this, which isn't good or bad.
I mean, that sort of happens with non-open format drafts as well. Like, if you send terrible signals, then they won't learn how to do good signaling.
Yeah, but you're going to find like Eric could pick 20 lands out of his 36 cards.
I've done it. I've done it.
He's done it.
It might have been 19 because I got to the end and I was like, shit, I need one more non-land card.
It was something thereabouts, yeah.
Yeah.
But things like that, little quirks that may pass off quicker than they would in a closed format.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
As for scaling the size up or down, we just came to the number we did at 4 players via repetition. Like, we've done all sorts of variants on this. We just liked how the 9x10 grid felt, having 90 cards 4 times. You saw a good percentage of my cube, and having 9 picks in each of the 4 grids for each player. You saw a good amount of the grid. You couldn't pick everything from the grid that you wanted usually.
Right.
You were normally like really nail biting that last choice on each one, even though by the time you're done, after a few repetitions, you'll realize it does not matter that you had to leave that, that one card you really wanted in the grid to get wiped away.
Right.
Because you're seeing such a large volume of the draft that you're still going to have crazy hard cuts getting down to 23 cards or whatever.
Yeah, which is one of those, like, even at 36 picks total, cutting is still pretty difficult.
It's painful.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, we just kind of came to this through trial and error, and it seems to work pretty well for a good balance of seeing the cube, seeing the cards in each grid, and not being too few or too many at the end.
Yeah, you don't want it to just be rotisserie draft, but weird.
Yeah.
So you do want the game aspect to it. You want the mystery of, oh God, did I pick wrong here? Is the other card going to actually show up? I don't know. It should.
Yeah.
But maybe it doesn't, and I just get bad beats from it.
And, like, sometimes there's, like, oh, I might take this pick, but it's realistically, like, a 23rd card in the deck. Or I could take this other pick that doesn't really do anything in my deck, but opens up 4 more cards to see what flips.
Yeah. Which, that is a strategy to get, like, further into things. That is something you learn to do when you're like, if I take this card, it's probably not going to make my deck anyway. So I'll take this other card that's not going to take my deck, but opens up a whole different corner of options to look at for next go around.
Right.
But I'm also opening it up for my opponent first.
Yeah.
Very entertaining gameplay in the draft, which is something that I enjoy about the format that a lot of other draft formats just don't have. As for why you end up at exactly 36 cards in ours, we found that when we went too much lower than that, if you like subtracted 1 from each of the 4 grids, you end up at 32 picks per person. You could still have very good drafts from everybody with that, and you're probably still going to have to make some hard cuts.
Yeah.
But that basically eliminated the ability to pivot.
Right.
Like, you were basically locked in after your first grid. So by going with 36, you're open to pivoting still. A single color change should not be a big deal if you're like, oh, I don't want to go into blue-white control. Blue-black control is way more open because someone's picking up like a bigger white deck somewhere else. So you've got the option there very simply. And you've got the real, screw it, I'm going from the lands deck into a spellsy blue-red deck.
Right.
You can do the hard changeover too if it's early enough in the draft still. And you're getting really good signals that the deck is basically abandoned by the other drafters.
Yeah, and at 36, it was one of those, like, you can realistically pivot pretty late if it's not a major pivot. Like, if it's still like, okay, half of my cards are still going to go into this deck, but things just aren't really working out for the Spellsy deck, so I need to do something else.
Yeah, I'll go for more tap-out control in it.
Yeah, so it's one of those that, like, 32 was a bit tough. It kind of railroaded a bit too much. And on that, it's one of those that, like, this is our example of 4-player because that's usually what we end up playing it as. This could technically go down to 2 players, but you probably don't want quite 36 picks total, and the grid is going to be smaller. Could go up to like 6 players, but the grids are going to be bigger, and you're probably going to want maybe 42 picks, 40 picks, something like that.
Yeah, the numbers aren't sacred by any means. Experiment when you do it. Try out some different sizes, maybe different grid shapes too.
Yeah.
We've mostly stuck to near square. but I was having fever dreams the other night of like, what if we tried like a really weird, like a Tetris tower or something,
Yeah.
where it's like super tall and skinny, and see how that changed the format any.
Yeah.
I don't know what it would do really if it would just play poorly, but that's kind of the fun of this format for us, is it's something that's just been, every time we play it, we go, do we want to just go standard or do we want to try something weird?
Right.
But yeah, like you were saying, the like star shape thing, but I think once you have too much surface area, then the flipping over all external cards becomes a problem.
Right.
Although then the question is, do you do like a star and you only flip the corners in the center?
Yeah. There's a lot of things that can be done with it that are like really fairly small changes that can drastically, like, if you don't flip the center cards, it's a substantially different draft experience than if you have the outer and the center.
We liked the center specifically for, like I was talking about, where it's like you're on the outer edge, you've dug in a little bit, you're kind of locked up to where nothing's really great for your deck and other people are getting what they need. And you can just Hail Mary grab a center card that you don't really think is going to make your deck, but it opens up 3 more cards to look at immediately
Right.
that are in a totally unrelated location, anything that's been done before.
Yeah, which just adds that extra bit of interest during the drafting. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of small tweaks that can be made to it, but the core aspects is, grids of a certain amount of cards that you can only draft face-up cards, and you only turn certain cards face-up.
Yeah, it is worth noting that in our game, it's usually played at 4 players. And because there's 4 players and 4 grids, you just roll to see who is first on the first grid. And then you just go around the table and each person then is first on the next grid.
Right.
We also, instead of doing a pure 1 through 4, then 1 through 4 on drafting over and over for which seed is picking, we do a back and forth snake, where you go, the first person to pick goes to the second, to the third, to the fourth, who gets to double pick, and then back to the third, to the second, to the first, who then double picks.
Right.
We found this led to a lot of very interesting gaminess during the draft, where you might get slight more balance on each grid. Technically, since everyone has a go at it in each of the seats, it doesn't matter.
Sure. But it's one of those that, like, the first pick gets the first pick, but the last pick in it also gets the second, like, gets to pick 2 in a row.
Yeah, which is a very strong seat to be in. It's a fascinating thing. You don't have to abide by that, but I would recommend trying it out when you do it, because it adds a lot of gameplay to the draft format.
Right. It's gameplay, but it's also kind of like a politics kind of thing. Like, if you screw with somebody, they can do the same to you.
Especially if you're, let's say you're like guy number 3 on said grid.
Right.
And guy number 4 is in a tangentially related deck to yours, to where the same good stuff cards are going in both of your decks.
Right.
There is a lot of don't you dare take that or I will murder that pick you want.
Yeah.
Or the screw it, the only person who gets to see that card before me is him. I'll flip it over and we'll see what we get. And then boom, it's the GT and you just start swearing.
Oh, yeah. That happens all the time.
Oh, it's so good. When you're like, man, I just need this one like really good stuff card to like lock all this together.
Yeah.
You flip it and the guy's just like, oh, you hate to see it. And they grab it and they're like, this is mine now.
The worst part is when you flip a fetch land that's in their colors as well, and you're like, fuck.
Yeah. Or the duel when you're both in like 2 colors looking to splash that third color or whatever.
Right.
Oh, the worst.
Obviously, they're taking it because it's going in their deck and it's going to be a glue to theirs, but you really, really wanted it.
You can beg and go, don't you remember when I didn't pick that card 2 grids ago?
Right.
There's a lot of very fun gameplay, and I think that sums up the feelings I have for Minesweeper Draft and why it is my favorite draft format.
Yeah, it's super fun. It really is.
All right, that should wrap up everything we were looking to talk about with it. This should be a nice short, instructional thing and advertisement for the format, so hopefully you want to try it out with your group if you have lots of 4-player draft nights.
Yeah, don't forget to take a look at the show notes for pictures. It will be very obvious what we were talking about when you just look at the pictures.
Yes. So look at the show notes, try this out with your group. Feel free to send in an email to the show or talk to us on Discord or Reddit or wherever. I am sure we would love to hear whatever you have to say on that. Maybe you found some cool twists that you tried out that you think we should try out. I'm game.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what everybody else can do with it.
All right, that does it for this, though. Let's hit our outro, do a quick bit of news, and get out of here for the evening.
Sounds good.